These three maps have a very special place in Australian scientific history. They are some of the earliest geological maps produced in this country. This exquisite hand-drawn map from 1853 is the very first geological map produced by a government geological survey organisation in this country. So how did this come about? The discovery of gold at Castlemaine was announced in September 1851, and with the realisation that a major gold rush was underway, Governor La Trobe in Melbourne wrote to London asking for an experienced geologist to evaluate Victoria's mineral wealth. That geologist was Hoddle-Selwyn. He arrived in late 1852 and immediately headed to the new Castlemaine and Bendigo goldfields. Sometime in early 1853, Hoddle-Selwyn was given this basic topographic map onto which he would place his observations. This colouring that you see here is Selwyn's work. So he coloured in the granitic areas this pinky red colour and the volcanic areas this green shading. And he also made some notes down along the Campaspe River about the detail of the rocks that he observed along the way. Apart from the geology, this map is important for another reason. It represents some of the earliest systematic topographic mapping in Victoria, at least by Europeans. This mapping started in 1836 when surveyor Thomas Mitchell led an expedition across Western Victoria. He mapped rivers, mountains, and made notes on geology. But more significantly, his glowing reports on the rich volcanic plains led to the colonisation of this part of Victoria. Within 4 years, the indigenous people of central Victoria had been displaced by the European colonisers. This was a whole decade before the gold rush. To facilitate colonisation, the authorities in Melbourne sent out government surveyors to map the major features of the land. Much of this surveying was done in the 1840s, and this map represents a compilation of much of that early work. The surveyor's mapping method was to follow the principal streams and then to mark in any prominent hills and mountains. They measured lengths with a chain and angles with an instrument called a circumferenter, just like this one here. Now, these techniques were rudimentary by today's standards, but nevertheless, they managed to achieve incredible accuracy on these maps. Surveyors had a good working knowledge of geology, and if you look closely at this map, you'll see notes describing the rock types they found along the creeks and in the nearby hills. But what makes this map so intriguing is that they also noted the principal vegetation types. And because most of the mapping was completed between 1843 and 1852, we have here a snapshot of what the land looked like in that period immediately following contact with First Nations people. Some people assume that there were large areas of central Victoria that were covered by trees before colonisation, but this map shows that simply was not the case. Many of today's grassy plains were grassy plains in the 1840s and probably had been that way for thousands of years. The plains were probably kept clear of trees by Indigenous burning practices. First Nations guides often accompanied the surveyors during their work in the 1840s, and you can see the influence of this in some of the place names. For example, Mount Tarrangower and Lani Barramore, which has been renamed by Europeans as Mount Franklin. After 1853, Hoddle-Selwyn assembled a team of geologists to create even more detailed maps, and these were based on the system created by the British Geological Survey, the so-called quarter sheets. These two quartersheets were mapped between the late 1850s and 1865 by George Ulrich and Christopher Aplin near Castlemaine, and Ulrich and Henry Brown at Malden. Unlike Selwyn, they weren't given a pre-existing topographic map. They had to map all the gullies and hills themselves. This was exceptionally tedious work, but it was essential to plot all their detailed geological observations. Europeans may have been the first to produce these types of geological maps, but First Nations peoples had an intimate knowledge of the local resources and the landscape. They were using stones for hatchets, for scrapers, and for grinding tools. They knew where to go to find the best quality stone for these purposes. So I think it's fair to say that the first geological observations in Victoria were made by Indigenous people.